In the spring of 1961, a seed company salesman named Gary Talbert drove his brand new Chevy pickup down a gravel road in Pottawattamie County, Iowa, and stopped at every farm along the way. He had a briefcase full of brochures and a trunk full of sample packets, and he was selling the future. The future was called hybrid seed corn. Gary had been making this drive for 3 years now, and every year the reception got warmer. Farmers who had been skeptical in 1958 were true believers by 1961. The yields were undeniable. Hybrid seed corn produced 30, 40, sometimes 50% more bushels per acre than the open-pollinated varieties farmers had been saving and replanting for generations. The numbers didn't lie. The future had arrived, and Gary Talbert was its messenger. He stopped at every farm on that road. Every one of them bought. Except the last one. The last farm on the road belonged to a man named Eldon Marsh. Eldon was 52 years old and had farmed the same 160 acres in Pottawattamie County since 1935, when his father had handed him the operation and moved to Omaha to live with his sister. Eldon was not a complicated man. He went to church, paid his bills, kept his fences tight, and grew corn and soybeans the way his father had grown them and his grandfather before that. He was not opposed to progress in principle. He had bought a tractor when tractors made sense. He had put in a grain bin when grain bins made sense. But Gary Talbert's hybrid seed corn did not make sense to Eldon Marsh, not for the reason Gary expected. "The yields are real," Eldon said, standing in his driveway while Gary made his pitch. "I believe you about the yields." "Then what's the hesitation?" Gary asked. "You can't replant it." Gary smiled the patient smile of a man who has answered this objection 100 times. "That's correct. Hybrid seed doesn't breed true in the second generation. You purchase new seed every year, but the yield increase more than pays for the cost of." "My grandfather saved his own seed," Eldon said. "My father saved his own seed. I save my own seed. I know what's in my barn. I know where it came from. I know how it performs on my particular ground in my particular soil with my particular weather." He looked at Gary's brochure. "Your seed performs better on average, but I don't farm average, I farm this." He gestured at the 160 acres around him. "Mr. Marsh, with respect, every farmer on this road just bought hybrid seed. You'll be the only one." "I'll be the only one who still has his own seed in 10 years, Eldon said. "Come back then and tell me which of us made the smarter choice." Gary Talbert drove away, already thinking about his next stop. He would come back the following year and the year after that and every year for the next 22 years. Eldon Marsh would say no every single time. Let me tell you about Eldon Marsh, because to understand what he built in that barn over the following decades, you need to understand the man who built it. Eldon was the kind of farmer who made other farmers slightly uncomfortable without meaning to. He wasn't loud about his opinions. He didn't lecture at the co-op or argue at the grain elevator. He just did things his own way, quietly and consistently, and let the results speak for whatever they were going to speak. His father, Harold Marsh, had farmed through the Depression. Harold had watched neighbors lose everything: land, equipment, dignity, because they had borrowed against good years and couldn't survive the bad ones. Harold had passed one lesson to his son above all others: never put yourself in a position where someone else controls what you need to survive. Hybrid seed to Eldon was exactly that position. Every spring, if you planted hybrid seed, you went back to the company. You paid whatever the company charged. You accepted whatever varieties the company had decided to sell that year. You were dependent in a way that his grandfather had never been dependent, in a way that felt fundamentally wrong to a man who had been raised to believe that self-sufficiency was not just a practical virtue but a moral one. So Eldon kept his own seed. Not carelessly, not as stubbornness for its own sake. Eldon Marsh approached seed saving the way a librarian approaches a rare book collection, with method, with documentation, and with a clear understanding that what he was preserving had value precisely because other people were discarding it. He had started in the early 1950s, before hybrid seed was even common in Pottawattamie County, by selecting the best ears from his best plants and saving them for the following year. He kept records in a spiral notebook: which varieties he planted where, which performed best in wet years versus dry years, which held up in late frosts, which pushed through drought. He cataloged his seed in labeled mason jars stored in a cool, dry corner of the barn where the temperature stayed consistent year-round. By 1961, when Gary Talbert made his first visit, Eldon already had 11 distinct varieties of open-pollinated corn that he had been selecting and improving for more than a decade. He had varieties that performed on the sandy south field where drainage was poor. He had varieties that did well on the heavier clay ground in the north. He had a late-maturing variety that consistently outperformed everything else in the long growing seasons that came every 4 or 5 years. None of this showed up in Gary Talbert's brochures. None of it was measurable by the university yield trials that Gary cited. It was local knowledge, accumulated slowly, applied carefully, worth more on Eldon's specific 160 acres than any average yield statistic from a company test plot in another county. The neighbors thought he was being stubborn. The seed company salesman thought he was being foolish. The county extension agent, a well-meaning man named Don Pierce, stopped by once in 1965 to gently suggest that Eldon might want to reconsider his position. Eldon, Don said, looking at the mason jars lined up on the barn shelf, these varieties haven't been improved in 20 years. The hybrid companies are putting millions of dollars into research every year. You simply can't compete with that. Eldon looked at his jars. I'm not competing with them, he said. I'm doing something different. They're optimizing for average conditions across a wide geography. I'm optimizing for my conditions on my land. Those aren't the same problem. Don Pierce nodded politely and drove away, thinking Eldon Marsh was a nice man who didn't fully understand what he was talking about. Now let me tell you about the 1970s, because that is when the pressure became intense. The farm boom of the 1970s changed everything. Export demand for American grain drove corn prices to record highs. The government encouraged expansion, the banks encouraged borrowing, and the seed companies, riding the boom alongside everyone else, began consolidating. Small regional seed companies were bought by larger ones. Varieties that only a few farmers grew were discontinued. The selection narrowed. Every farmer in Pottawattamie County was planting hybrid seed by 1972. Every farmer except Eldon Marsh. He became a curiosity, then a joke. At the co-op, someone would occasionally mention Eldon and his mason jars, and there would be laughter. Not mean laughter, the affectionate laughter you give to an eccentric neighbor who isn't hurting anyone. Old Eldon and his antique seeds, farming like it's 1920. The seed company sent a new salesman in 1974. A younger man named Steve Colton who had grown up on a farm and thought he would be able to connect with Eldon better than Gary Talbert had. Steve sat at Eldon's kitchen table and spread out yield comparison charts. Mr. Marsh, look at these numbers. Your neighbors are averaging 140 bushels an acre. Our top hybrid is hitting 160, 165 in good years. That's a 30 bushel difference on 160 acres. That's 4,800 extra bushels. At current prices, that's real money. Eldon looked at the charts. What did my neighbors average in 1970? Steve checked his records. 1970 was a dry year. Most of the county was around 95 bushels. What did I average? Steve didn't have Eldon's numbers, but Eldon did. He pulled out his own notebook. 112 bushels, Eldon said. That dry year I was 17 bushels ahead of the county average because I've been selecting for drought tolerance on my particular soil for 20 years. He closed the notebook. Your hybrid is better in a normal year, my seed is better in a bad year, and bad years are the ones that break people. Steve Colton drove away. He would not come back. But the laughter at the co-op continued, and the pressure continued. And Eldon Marsh continued to say no and continued to label his mason jars and continued to make his notes in his spiral notebooks year after year while the world moved in a direction that had no use for what he was doing. Let me tell you about 1983, because that is when Eldon's son came home. Robert Marsh was 30 years old and had spent 8 years in Des Moines working for an insurance company. He had grown up on the farm but left it behind, convinced that farming was a hard way to make a modest living and that the city offered something better. He had been reasonably right about that for 8 years. Then his father had a mild heart attack in October of 1983, recovered fully, but was told by his doctor to reduce his workload. Robert came home for what he thought would be a few months and stayed. The first thing Robert noticed was the barn. Not the structure itself, but what was in it. 3 walls of shelving floor to ceiling lined with mason jars, hundreds of them, each one labeled in his father's careful handwriting, variety name, year of selection, field of origin, key characteristics. Beside the jars, a row of notebooks going back to 1951, 32 years of records, 32 years of observation, selection, and documentation. Dad, Robert said, looking at the shelves, how many varieties do you have? 37 corn varieties, Eldon said. 14 bean varieties, 8 squash, 6 different tomatoes for the kitchen garden, 22 varieties of small grains, wheat, oats, rye, a couple of things I got from an old German farmer over in Carroll County that I don't even know the original names for. Robert was quiet for a long moment. Does anyone else have these? Eldon shrugged. Some of them maybe, some of them I don't know. Some of the old varieties I started with I got from my father who got them from his father. I've never seen them anywhere else. He ran his hand along a row of jars. That's why I kept them. You can't save something after it's gone. Robert Marsh had grown up thinking his father was simply stubborn. Standing in that barn in 1983, he began to understand that what he was looking at was not stubbornness. It was a library, the most important library in Pottawattamie County, Iowa, and nobody knew it existed. He stayed, he learned. He began keeping the records himself when his father's handwriting grew unsteady. Let me tell you about the farm crisis of the 1980s. Because it hit Pottawattamie County hard, the way it hit every Iowa county hard, and it changed the neighborhood around the Marsh farm in ways that nobody had predicted. The farmers who had borrowed to expand during the boom years found themselves underwater when land values collapsed. Foreclosures happened on every road in the county. Equipment auctions every weekend. Families that had farmed the same ground for 4 generations gone in a single season. Eldon Marsh had never borrowed. He watched it happen from his farm the way you watch a storm from inside a solid house, with sympathy for the people caught in it and a quiet gratitude that you had built your walls the way you had built them. But there was something else happening during the farm crisis that didn't make the newspapers and didn't get discussed at the co-op. The seed companies, struggling along with everyone else, were discontinuing varieties. The hybrids that had sold well in boom years didn't sell at all when farmers had no money. The companies cut their catalogs. The varieties disappeared. Not just from the catalogs, from existence. When a seed company discontinued a variety and destroyed its inventory, that variety was gone. There was nowhere to get it back from. It had existed for decades as a specific arrangement of genetic material adapted to specific conditions, capable of performing in specific ways, and then it simply ceased to be. Most people never thought about this. Why would they? There were still plenty of seeds to buy. The remaining hybrids were still highly productive. The loss was invisible because you can't see something that no longer exists. Eldon saw it. He had been watching it happen since the early 1970s, as variety after variety disappeared from the regional seed catalogs, as the genetic diversity of American corn narrowed steadily toward a smaller and smaller number of highly optimized, commercially successful lines. He kept saving, kept labeling, kept making notes. Robert watched his father work and began to understand the full shape of what was being preserved. This was not just about Eldon's farm. This was about what happened when a system that had been diverse for 10,000 years was suddenly and rapidly narrowed to a handful of varieties that were all optimized for the same conditions, all vulnerable to the same threats. Now let me tell you about 1988, because that is the year that proved everything. The summer of 1988 was the worst drought in Iowa since the Dust Bowl. June and July were brutally hot and dry. The corn crop across the Midwest failed on a scale that hadn't been seen in decades. Iowa farmers who had been averaging 130, 140, 150 bushels an acre harvested 60. Some harvested nothing. Some didn't bother to harvest at all because the cost of running the combine exceeded the value of what was in the field. Pottawattamie County was hit as hard as anywhere. The farmers who had survived the financial crisis of the mid-1980s now faced a production crisis. The hybrid varieties that had delivered record yields in good years had no reserve capacity for extreme drought. They had been optimized for average conditions, and 1988 was not an average year. Eldon Marsh harvested 94 bushels an acre. Not spectacular, but in a county where the average was 58, it was the difference between a profitable year and a catastrophic one. His drought-tolerant variety, the one he had been selecting for dry performance since 1957, 31 years of incremental improvement on his specific sandy loam ground, had done what it was selected to do. Robert drove to the elevator with their grain and stood in line behind neighbors who were delivering a fraction of what they had expected. Some of them had tears on their faces. Some of them were doing the math in their heads, calculating how much the shortfall was going to cost them against their operating loans. "How'd you do?" one of the neighbors asked Robert in line. 94. The man looked at him. 94 bushels, how? "Dad's seed," Robert said. The old varieties he's been selecting for drought years since before you and I were farming. The man was quiet for a moment, then he said something Robert has never forgotten. I always thought your dad was crazy, keeping all those old seeds when the hybrids were so much better. He paused. Turns out he was keeping them for a year like this. Word spread through the county the way things spread in farm country, slowly at first, then faster, then everywhere. Eldon Marsh's old seed had outperformed the hybrids in the drought by 36 bushels an acre, on ground that had been farming with open-pollinated varieties for 30 years while everyone else had switched. The seed company salesman did not come back that year. Instead, the farmers came to Eldon. Let me tell you about the fall of 1988, because that is when the barn became something none of them had expected it to become. They started arriving in September after harvest, after the full scale of the disaster was clear. Neighbors who had laughed at Eldon's mason jars for 20 years, farmers from the next township over who had heard the story secondhand, a county extension agent not Don Pierce who had retired, but a younger man named Phil Kramer who had grown up hearing about Eldon Marsh the eccentric seed saver and had always been curious. They came to see the barn, they came to ask questions, they came, some of them, with a humility that had cost them a hard year to develop. Eldon showed everyone around. He didn't say I told you so. He didn't talk about the 27 years of salesmen he had turned away. He just walked the shelves and talked about the seeds, where they came from, what they were selected for, how they performed, what they could do that the hybrids couldn't, and vice versa. You have to understand, Eldon said to Phil Kramer, who was taking notes with the focused attention of a man who realizes he is learning something important. These varieties aren't better than the hybrids across the board. In a normal year, a good year, the hybrids produce more. That's true and it will stay true. But a farming operation isn't just normal years. A farming operation is all the years, the wet ones and the dry ones and the late frost years and the years when everything goes wrong at once. These varieties have been tested on this ground through all of those years. They have memory that the hybrids don't have. Memory, Phil repeated. A seed that's been grown on this particular ground for 30 years has adapted to this ground. The plants that didn't thrive got culled. The ones that did got saved, generation after generation. That's not something you can buy from a catalog. That's something you build over time on your own land with your own hands. Phil Kramer wrote a report for the Iowa State Extension Service. The report described what Eldon had been doing for 27 years and argued that his seed collection represented a significant agricultural resource, not just for Pottawattamie County, but potentially for the broader region. He recommended that the collection be formally documented and that a program be developed to preserve and share the varieties. The report circulated. Things moved slowly, the way they do in agricultural institutions, but they moved. By 1991, Iowa State University had sent a team of researchers to catalog Eldon's collection. They spent 3 weeks in the barn with microscopes and germination tests and genetic sampling equipment that Eldon watched with polite interest and no particular awe. They identified 6 varieties in his collection that existed nowhere else in any seed bank or university collection in the United States. 6 varieties that, without Eldon's mason jars and spiral notebooks, would simply have ceased to exist. The lead researcher, a woman named Dr. Karen Aldrich, sat at Eldon's kitchen table after the 3rd week and told him what they had found. Mr. Marsh, she said, do you understand what you have here? Seeds, Eldon said. You have genetic diversity that the commercial system discarded over the past 30 years and that cannot be recreated. Some of these varieties carry drought tolerance traits that we don't fully understand yet. Some have disease resistance characteristics that we haven't seen in modern lines. If we had lost these, she paused, we would have lost them permanently. There's no way to get back genetic material that no longer exists in any living plant. Eldon looked at the mason jars lined up on the kitchen counter, brought in from the barn for the researchers to examine. My father always said you should keep the things that work, he said. Even if you're not using them right now, you might need them later. Your father was right. He usually was. Robert Marsh, listening from across the kitchen, thought about Gary Talbert and his Chevy pickup driving away down the gravel road in 1961, about 30 years of salesman, about the laughter at the co-op, about his own 8 years in Des Moines, convinced that the farm was the past and the city was the future. He thought about 1988, about 94 bushels in a county that averaged 58. About what it costs to be right for 30 years before anyone notices. Let me tell you about what happened after, because the story doesn't end in a university researcher's report. Eldon Marsh died in 1997 at the age of 88. He had farmed until 1994 when his body finally suggested that perhaps enough was enough, and he had spent his last 3 years in the farmhouse doing what he had always done in the hours between work: reading, keeping records, sitting on the porch watching the fields that had shaped everything he knew about the world. Robert took over the farm and the seed collection. He expanded the documentation, digitized his father's notebooks, began sharing seeds with other farmers through a small informal network that grew over the years into something more organized. The varieties that Eldon had been saving found their way to farms across Iowa and eventually across the Midwest, not replacing hybrid seed, which was still the practical choice for most commercial operations, but filling a role that the commercial system had abandoned, providing options for farmers who wanted something the catalog didn't offer. In 2003, a pathogen spread through the Iowa corn crop. It hit the hybrid varieties hard, moving through genetically similar populations the way disease moves through any monoculture: fast, broad, devastating. The farmers who lost the most were the ones who had planted the 2 or 3 most popular hybrid varieties, because all of those plants carried the same genetic vulnerabilities. Eldon's varieties were largely resistant. Not all of them, some were susceptible, and Robert lost part of his crop along with everyone else. But the diversity in the collection meant that some varieties held while others fell, and Robert harvested a reasonable crop in a year when his neighbors harvested almost nothing. He had seen this before. He had been 16 years old in 1988, standing in the elevator line behind men with tears on their faces, listening to his father's name being spoken with a kind of wondering respect by people who had spent years laughing at the mason jars. History on a farm tends to rhyme. The Marsh farm is still running. Robert's daughter Claire, the 4th generation on the same 160 acres, farms it now alongside her father. She grew up learning seed selection the way Robert had learned it from Eldon, and Eldon had learned it from Harold, and Harold had learned it from his own father on the same ground in the same county. The barn still has 3 walls of shelving. The mason jars are still labeled in careful handwriting, though the handwriting has changed through the generations. The collection has grown since Eldon's time. Claire has added varieties she found in the collections of elderly farmers in neighboring counties, varieties that were days from being lost when she tracked them down. Some of what she has found, the university researchers tell her, exists nowhere else. Eldon's spiral notebooks are in a fireproof cabinet in the farmhouse. 63 volumes, covering 1951 through 1994. A complete record of one man's conversation with the land he farmed for 43 years, conducted in the patient language of observation and selection and careful preservation. Gary Talbert retired from the seed company in 1979 and moved to Arizona. The varieties he spent 20 years selling have mostly been discontinued, replaced by newer hybrids that are more productive still. The companies that sold them have been bought and sold and consolidated, until the American seed industry is now dominated by 4 corporations. The number of commercially available corn varieties has declined by more than 80% since 1970. Nobody laughs at the mason jars anymore. In 2019, a documentary filmmaker came to the Marsh farm to make a short film about the seed collection. She spent a week in the barn, filming the jars and the notebooks and the fields, and Claire walking the rows in August the way Eldon had walked them, reading the plants, selecting the best for the following year. At the end of the week, the filmmaker asked Claire what she thought her great-grandfather would make of all the attention. Claire thought about it for a moment, then she said something that ended up in the film and that people who see the film tend to remember. He'd probably say that the attention is nice, but the seeds are what matter. The seeds are what was always going to matter. He just didn't know how long he'd have to wait for everyone else to figure that out. She walked back toward the barn. Inside, 37 varieties of open-pollinated corn that Eldon Marsh had spent his life selecting sat in their labeled mason jars in the cool, dry corner of the barn where the temperature stayed consistent year-round. Waiting. The way good things wait. The way things worth keeping wait patiently for the moment when the world finally understands why they were kept. Gary Talbert had the future in his briefcase in 1961. He was right about a great many things. The hybrids were more productive. The yields were real. The modern system worked better for most farmers in most years. But Eldon Marsh had something Gary Talbert's briefcase didn't have room for. He had the years that weren't most years. He had the drought years and the disease years and the years when everything the system had optimized for turned out to be the wrong thing to have optimized for. He had the memory of the land and the patience of a man who understood that farming is not one season but all the seasons, not one year but the whole long conversation between a family and the ground they have chosen to tend. He had 37 varieties of corn in mason jars and he had 63 notebooks, and he had been right for 30 years before anyone noticed. That is what it costs to save something the world has decided it doesn't need. That is what it is worth when the world changes its mind.